Welcome to Class 6 of Hebrew Exegesis, BRITE Old Testament 506. Today we're going to be looking at the uses of the infinitive in Hebrew syntax, as well as the uses of the particle ki, kaf with the heric yod, seeing how these form so-called key clauses and the uses of such within the Hebrew text. As we begin, let me comment quickly on the definition of syntax. Syntax is basically a discussion of how words go together. We have examined words in our word studies thus far this semester, but now we're talking about how those words actually fit together. For example, there is a big difference between we are going to eat grandma and we are going to eat grandma. The same with he turned into a driveway. Did he turn into a driveway or did he turn into the driveway? It makes a big difference in our understanding of each of those sentences as we understand the proper syntax and the proper explanation of what those sentences mean. The same is true even of the phrase I'm going to or I'm going to, seeing that the word to can be used either to say I'm going to as though I intend to do something or I'm going to as though I'm also going. These are evident in the way that the text is written, but not necessarily in the way that the text is spoken. The same is true of Hebrew. We are looking not at a spoken text, we are looking at the written text. So we are going to be examining the syntax of how this written text fits together. Let's begin by looking at the infinitive, keeping in mind that in Hebrew there are two types of infinitives, the infinitive absolute and the infinitive construct. We will look at both, but let's begin with the infinitive absolute. The most common appearance of the infinitive absolute is for affirmation or emphasis, often translated as surely. This takes place when it is partnered with another verb. Before the verb, it is called a prepositive use of the infinitive absolute. After a verb, postpositive. Some scholars have suggested that a postpositive use of the infinitive absolute is less emphatic than the prepositive. However, the imperative, the participle, and the viactol will always have the infinitive absolute in a postpositive use. So that theory is in question as to whether or not it really is emphasizing less than a prepositive, or if it's just simply part of the form. However, as we examine the Hebrew text, we realize there are a couple places where the infinitive absolute is used in a non-emphatic way. For instance, in Genesis chapter 43, verse 20, it becomes very odd if we only consider an emphatic use of the verb. The brothers of Joseph are talking to the person who is in charge of handing out the food after they have discovered that all of their money has been put back in their sacks, and they say to the steward, the master, the Adonai of Joseph's house, they say to him, "Oh, my lord, we came down the first time surely to buy food." Well, surely doesn't really make a whole lot of sense here. Surely we came down? Perhaps the infinitive absolute is being used in a different way because surely seems somewhat nonsensical. We also have non-emphatic uses of the infinitive absolute, such as Proverbs 25:27, where we read that eating too much honey can be bad, or literally, eating too much honey is not good. The eating here is the infinitive absolute being used as a subject. This is rare, but it is a non-emphatic use of the infinitive, and is something to keep in mind as we look at the different uses of the infinitive absolute, that it is not always simply emphatic. The actual translation of the infinitive absolute may be nuanced by the stem in which it is found. The different stems have different usages, which I'm not going to get into, since those can be found in your reading, and since we talked about those quite a bit in elementary Hebrew. However, it is important to recognize that the infinitive absolute is most often found in the same stem as the verb. However, there are a couple cases where the kal will be used, for instance with the nifal, but this is very rare. It is almost never found where we have a nifal and a piel or a piel and a pual. If it's a different stem, it will often be a kal, but again, not very common, unless it is found in a phrase that is often used, such as the phrase, surely be put to death, in which case we often have a kal with a nifal or a kal with a hiphil. The several usages of the infinitive absolute that are worth noting is, for instance, doubt or by chance. Genesis 37 verse 8 asks the question, will you surely rule over us? Here we have a question that's being raised by Joseph's brothers to Joseph. However, if we just say surely, will you surely, we're left with the question of, is it surely Or are they asking a question? Are they raising doubt? Will you really rule over us? This seems to be more the force than simply surely. The same with the word if, even if the word if is not present. In Numbers chapter 12, verse 14, God says to Moses, if her father had spit in her face, the her being Miriam, would she not be shut up for 7 days? Which is why Miriam is afflicted with leprosy for opposing Moses and is shut up for 7 days. But the word if is not present here. Literally, it just reads, surely he spit. But we understand that this is a question clause, if, or a conditional if. And so we have to supply the word if based on the context, even though if is not found here. So again, surely he spit does not really make sense in the context, but if does. Genesis 2:16 contains a usage of the infinitive absolute that appears to simply be emphatic. Surely you will eat. But really what is in question is permission. You may eat, or you can eat of any tree in the garden. Judges 15:13 also has unusual syntax in that it begins with an answer, lo, no, for binding you. This is the people saying to Samson, we will only bind you and hand you over, indicating that they're not going to kill Samson, only bind him with ropes. Of course, he breaks the ropes and kills everybody else, but that's another part of the story. Judges chapter 4, verse 9 is really a use of concession, as Deborah is saying to Barak, basically, I guess I'll go with you. She doesn't say, surely I'll go with you, because she doesn't want to go. She wants Barak to go by himself, and so she says, okay, I'll go. So this is more of a concessive use of the infinitive absolute rather than emphatic. Judges 7:19 also has a use of the infinitive absolute that should be translated as just. They had just set the guard. This was the beginning of the watch, and so the watch had just started, the guards had just been appointed. It was a newly set watch. So here we have 4 other uses besides the emphatic that can be found throughout the Old Testament using the infinitive absolute. Occasionally we have 2 infinitive absolutes in the same sentence, in which case the actions of the infinitive absolute should be understood as simultaneous action. Sometimes we even have an infinitive absolute that comes after a verb and actually continues the action of that verb, almost like another verb. For instance, in Jeremiah 22, we read that he shall be buried like a donkey. He shall be buried and dragged and thrown outside the city walls. But here we have sochov, which is a infinitive absolute, dragged, immediately following yikaver, he will be buried. As though there is a vav and a second verb there, but there's not. Instead, it's an infinitive absolute. But it is clear that he shall be buried and dragged. However, part of the dragged is nonsensical if we see it as a consecutive action, because it's hard to bury someone and then drag them. So this is almost, he'll be buried as in not really buried. He's going to be dragged and thrown outside the city walls. So here we have the infinitive absolute that's giving nuance or a further explanation of what exactly it means to be buried like a donkey. He means not buried at all, simply thrown on the refuse pile. We also have continuity of action, or the continuation of an action, or a further understanding of that action, such as in Genesis 8:3, when it says that the waters upon the earth returned, chalok, going. Here we have an explanation of they returned, but they returned by leaving. The waters, as it's often translated in the English versions, receded. But here we actually have 2 verbs, vayashuvu and halok. So we have they returned to go. But when we put the 2 of them together, we understand that what it means is they receded, they went, using 2 verbs to accomplish the work of 1. In some instances, the infinitive absolute can be used just like a verb, but without the presence of another verb. For instance, at the beginning of 2 Kings 5:10, as Elisha is telling Naaman to go wash in the Jordan River, he says, go and wash. This is 2 verbs, but the first one is actually an infinitive absolute, not an imperative. In Deuteronomy 5:12, we read the same thing, you must keep the Sabbath day. But again, it's an infinitive absolute, to keep the Sabbath day, translated as an imperative, or you must. Sometimes the infinitive absolute is used in place of a future verb, such as Isaiah 5:5, where God says that he's going to break down the hedge around the vineyard that is Israel. But again, the breakdown here is a infinitive absolute, not a perfect or imperfect verb. Sometimes it's used as a present verb, such as in Proverbs 12:7, which says that the wicked are overturned and are no more, as though this is taking place right now or has recently taken place. Hafok has overturned. And in Haggai 1:9, we actually see the infinitive absolute being used as past tense. You turned, or you looked for much, but there was little. The you looked is actually an infinitive absolute. To look for much. So here in all of these instances, we see the infinitive absolute being used almost like another verb. Just some quick thoughts on the infinitive construct. Oftentimes when we have the construct partnered with haya, we should be translating this as about to. Instead of it was to keep, it should be I was about to keep. The haya and the form of haya here indicates that it is about to happen. Most often the construct is referring to the future, although in many instances it's actually continuing the previous verb, such as Jeremiah 44:19 that talks about offering offerings to the Queen of Heaven, and yet the infinitive construct is used to continue the idea of offering, rather than using a consecutive verb. The reason I've talked about the infinitive here is not so that you'll memorize this list and come up with all the different usages for the infinitive absolute and infinitive construct. Instead, what I want you to recognize is that the infinitive absolute and the infinitive construct can be used in a lot more various ways than we have discussed in elementary Hebrew. Yes, the most common use of the infinitive absolute is that emphatic usage. However, we have seen a multitude of other usages here in these examples that I have shown you. So as you are studying and translating and exegeting, you need to keep in mind that an infinitive absolute may be used in a way that is different than expected. You will have to allow the context to guide you, and also look at a syntax guide, such as Waltke and O'Connor, or any of the other textbooks that you have from this semester, to determine the proper context and the proper interpretation of the infinitives. The same is true of the ki particle, kaf plus the hierarch yod, which introduces often a ki clause. We learned in elementary Hebrew that ki most often means for or because. However, there's a lot of other usages of this particular word, and again, I'm only going to give a few examples. A more fuller understanding of ki can be found in any of the major reference grammars or in any of the books on syntax, such as Waltke and O'Connor. Oftentimes, ki just simply means that, such as Genesis 3:6. He saw that it was good for food, literally that good, the tree for eating. Also in Exodus 3:12, the content is that they will see that I have sent you. God talking to Moses about what the people will see. Ki is often used as the context of a question, such as Psalm 8:5. What is man that you are mindful for him, and the Son of Man that you care for him, that you visit him? Again, this is content. What is it that, in terms of asking a question, what is it that you are doing? Sometimes a ki clause is used for affirming or emphasizing, or the technical term asseveration, making more severe, almost acting like the apodosis of a conditional statement. In Genesis chapter 18, verse 20, we read that the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is very great, except that the ki comes before great, and the ki comes before very weighty. Glorious is how we often translate kavod, but here it is weighty, heavy. The ki, though, is emphasizing the outcry. The outcry has come because, or for, or really, the outcry is so great, is so very great because of the great sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. So the ki is not really indicating the reason because of the outcry, but really indicating the greatness of the sin. In other instances, we have the ki clause actually being used as an introduction to an oath. Ki is used only for those positive oaths. Im, aleph mem, which means if, is most often used for the negative. So in this particular verse, Saul is swearing to Jonathan, God do so to me, and more also, you shall surely die. But here it's not because you shall surely die I'm swearing, it's just simply the content of the particular oath. The same is true in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 5, where it's being used as an exclamation, although again, aleph mem, will actually be used for a negative exclamation instead of a positive exclamation. Here, David is very angry after Nathan has told him the story of the man who stole the rich man stole the poor man's goat. David is very angry, and he says, "That man, as the Lord lives, that man shall surely die, who has done this." And so here again we have "that man shall surely die," the emphasis being indicated here by the key. Sometimes we actually have key being used in the temporal sense. So here in Judges chapter 1, verse 28, we read, "And it was when Israel grew strong," indicating the beginning of a cycle of Israel's apostasy as they become comfortable in their own strength. Again, the key here is not being used because, but it's used to indicate that something used to take place in the past tense. Sometimes a key clause indicates the beginning of a condition, such as if instead of eem. This is often used for case law in case of this happening. For instance, as we see in Exodus, talking about the goring of somebody by a bull, if that should happen. Oftentimes, though, if it is not going to happen, or if it's not the case, we will see lu, which is lamed shurik, indicating that it is a negative condition. It is not actually taking place. Sometimes key is used in a concessive sense, such as Isaiah 54:10, in which it is translated as though the mountains be moved. And then it can be emphasized even more with the particle gam, also or even, gimel mem, such as Psalm 23:4, gam ki, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Not gam im, even if, but gam ki. Again, this is many usages of the key clause, and I don't expect you to memorize all of them, but simply to be aware of the fact that key does not always mean for or because. Instead, there are other options for translating this particular phrase. Again, you can find these in any book on syntax, such as Choi and Fuller, which is one of our textbooks. You can also find it in Waltke and O'Connor, or in any reference grammar, including the older version of Gesenius, but also in Juan and Maraoka. Well, this brings us to the end of today's lecture. Again, my goal in introducing this information has not been to give you more things to memorize, but to simply be aware of the fact that an infinitive absolute, an infinitive construct, and the particle key may be used in ways that are different from what we saw in elementary Hebrew. The form of the word itself is not changing, the morphology remains the same, but the syntax, the actual usage of the word in the sentence, is different. Same with he turned into a driveway and he turned into a driveway. Was he actually transformed into a driveway, or did he just simply drive into the driveway? But even then, did he drive into the driveway as though he crashed, or did he drive onto the driveway? Which is not typically how we say it in English. We do say into. But what exactly do we mean? Again, the emphasis is on syntax, on word order, and the context of the word in the actual sentence. What exactly is the author attempting to communicate with this different type of syntax? So again, we need to consider our syntactical relationships between words and not just the dictionary definition of words, because words will change their meaning within their various syntax.